Hello, everyone. This is Momchil Kyurkchiev, the co-founder and CEO at Leanplum, and I'm really excited to be joined today by Andrew Chen, who does growth at Uber. And today we're going to be talking about mobile growth and retention. And my personal background, Momchil, co-founder CEO at Leanplum. Prior to Leanplum, 4 years ago, I spent many years at Google on what essentially was the growth team at YouTube, running multiple tests, running personalization, experimentation, and ultimately leading to a lot of growth improvements within YouTube watch time. And today, having left Google, we've started Leanplum and are a leading mobile marketing platform that works with major brands like Macy's, Nordstrom, and Expedia to be able to deliver mobile growth for them. And I'm really excited to be joined by Andrew Chen. Andrew Chen, if you don't mind, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience? You have quite a few followers online, and I'm really excited to have you attend the webinar today.
Cool, awesome. Well, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here and to talk about growth. Obviously, one of my favorite topics. You know, these days I'm at Uber, of course. You know, previously I was you know, working in the startup world, advising companies like Dropbox on growth as well. And then before that, working in the venture capital world. And so I've been writing my blog now for it's pretty amazing. It's been a while now. I think it's almost 10 years that I've been writing my blog ever since I moved to you know, the Bay Area, kind of writing down different observations and learnings about growth and all of its different you know, points of view and aspects of that I've been learning. And so anyway, I'm super happy to be part of this Q&A.
Sounds great. And so we're going to have live questions here. So anybody who has a question, please use hashtag LeanplumLive on Twitter, and we'll be reviewing these at the end of the webinar today. So let's dive right in. And so Andrew, you're one of the people who are the biggest contributors to the growth community out there. And I'm just curious, can you tell us what is the definition of growth hacking in your mind? You know, what is it and what is it not?
Yeah, so you know, growth hacking is kind of there's a fun little story behind it, and maybe I'll you know, go into that. So it was actually originally coined, and where I originally heard it from is a dude named Sean Ellis, awesome guy. So he worked in LA in the tech sector there, and had worked on a number of different companies and taking them public. And you know, sometime after that, he'd gotten to know Sequoia and a bunch of their companies, and so he was doing this very cool role where he was essentially running growth at 3 or 4 Sequoia portfolio companies at the same time, including Zobni, Eventbrite, Dropbox, and many others. And so, you know, what was funny was he told me a story about how when he talked to young founders, you know, young technical, super smart founders, and they were like, hey, you know, who's this guy, Sean, and how can he help us? And when Sequoia would say, oh, well, you know, he's a VP of growth, you know, everyone would immediately think, oh, he just wants to buy Super Bowl commercials, right? And so what he realized was, hey, you know, I need a better way to talk about this, because actually I'm about, you know, very much data-driven, product-oriented changes in order to scale your customers, and to do it in a way that often doesn't cost any money at all. And so he sort of said, you know, well, I'm really like a growth hacker, right? And so that's kind of how that term came about. And so I think what's been interesting is, you know, in the days that it's been, you know, that term was created, it's obviously had a tremendous amount of attention. You know, if you look at the Google Trends, you know, for growth hacker, what you see is that there's, you know, it's sort of up and to the right. And what's been happening is that, you know, I think in one notion of the term, you know, in terms of the growth teams that are at places like Uber and Facebook and Twitter, you know, these are very like product-driven, you know, teams full of engineers, designers, data scientists, PMs, et cetera, who all work together in a highly accountable way to, you know, increase KPIs at their company. I think, you know, that's kind of the core of the industry, and folks are often, you know, working on things like the sign-up flow, you know, referral programs, you know, notifications, landing pages, you know, a lot of kind of like core like levers that drive growth, within a company. Now, on the flip side, it's also sort of become, kind of a big umbrella that a lot of people want to get under. And so, a lot of folks that really are kind of traditional marketers, or they're like SEO consultants or social media folks, will also describe themselves as like growth hacking. And you could kind of extend it to that, but, I tend to like to stay with the definition that, a lot of teams are using, which is that growth is fundamentally about, the tech side of the business, product, engineering, data, design, and bringing that together in order to drive growth. And it just turns out that this is sort of a newish function that a lot of, companies are now trying to build. And, it's super exciting time in the industry because everyone's trying to figure out how to apply these ideas in order to their business, in order to sustain, sort of data-driven insights and connecting that with like product development.
Yeah, and absolutely timely as well, because there's hardly any company out there that doesn't need to grow, and this is really the crux of building a successful business, and so this is absolutely well needed. And just curious, what are some of the misunderstandings and misconceptions that you run into when it comes to mobile growth hacking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the biggest areas, and and let's sort of talk about, I mean, there's a bunch of, it's such an interesting question, right? But one of the ones that I'll just zoom in on is that people tend to think that, having a successful app is all about acquisition. It's just about getting featured or buying installs from the right networks and so on. And what you actually see is that you have this real danger of creating a shark fin, kind of pattern in your traffic. And where that comes from is, number one, your acquisition sort of scaling linearly, right? But then having your churn like overtake your acquisition. And what that does is it means that you go up really fast, in terms of your monthly actives or your active customer base, but then it quickly like tails off and craters. And you sort of see this kind of pattern, especially when, apps are trying to launch and they're trying to do it with a ton of PR, or they're doing with an app store feature, but they don't have the fundamental retention. So I think that one of the really interesting misconceptions is certainly around the idea that acquisition trumps, retention, when in fact you need to have expertise and tools and strategies, for both sides.
Great. So one of the things when I did a lot of those experiments in growth at YouTube were the ability to be able to all centralize around a common metric. And at YouTube, that metric was watch time. That was the one single metric, KPI, that everybody kind of rallied around. And how do you measure growth typically in your experience? Is it centralized, or is everybody working on their own set of metrics? What have you seen?
Yeah. Well, I think, ultimately you end up with a top-level metric that is either, like revenue or MAU or something that's like kind of encompasses everything. And then depending on the size of your team and PMs and everything, if you're a larger growth team, you're able to then break that down. So for example, MAU, you might break that down into new user acquisition versus activation versus long-term retention. Right, and then even within new user acquisition, then you could say, okay, well, great, what's our acquisition by viral versus paid versus SEO or those other channels? Whether, if it's engagement, then it might be something around like, DAU-MAU ratio. It could be, something around like click-through rates on notifications, et cetera. So I think when you really, you might have an overall North Star that everybody pushes towards, but then ultimately, you want to break the metrics down to the level where the individual teams and PMs are able to understand how they fit into the bigger picture.
Great. And so when it comes to growth hacking, have you noticed any particular differences within B2B and B2C, and specifically within the realm of mobile? I think B2B is a very new trend. We're starting to get some early traction with some B2B apps like Invoice2Go or Active Hours, but I was just curious, in your experience, what have you seen are the main differences?
Yeah, how you think about that? Well, I mean, I think that the structural differences are really interesting, and obviously, we also live in an age where, we have quite a bit of like consumerized B2B as well, right? Kind of these in-betweens like the Dropboxes and Slacks and, so on and so forth. And so, I think the biggest thing that you find is that in B2B, you have a much higher LTV for your customers, obviously because, they are being productive, they're used to spend, the budgets are there, et cetera, versus B2C end up being, more focused on, lower intent users. You're focusing on maybe aggregating audiences for advertising. And so I think, when you look at B2C versus B2B, that's why fundamentally the growth strategies end up being very different. So in B2C, for example, your viral loop becomes very important. So when you look at some of the largest products that have ever been, built, whether that's, the Facebooks or LinkedIn's or Skype's or, products that often have like hundreds of millions of active users, they're fundamentally driven by viral growth. And the reason for that is you need the viral growth because, that's the only way to get to a billion MAU. You're not going to like pay for a billion MAU, right? Versus on B2B, because you're talking about a much smaller base, you can talk about, a model which is completely based on like sales and account management, or something that's based on like purely content marketing, or paid acquisition, where that, hey, the LTV on the SaaS product is tens of thousands of dollars, and so you can spend, this upfront. And then the interesting part, of course, Momchil, kind of in between both of these models are products like Dropbox, which are so special in many ways, or like Slack, where, they're spread within an enterprise using consumerized virality, as the core thing. And then above and beyond that, they're able to then upsell a more enterprise product, right? So obviously, Yammer, Slack, even like, SurveyMonkey, and other SaaS products all kind of follow this approach. So I think, what we're kind of in a golden era now where especially that style of product is super interesting, and there's a lot of like, really interesting ideas that you can take away there.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the state of mobile growth, you mentioned LTV as a key driver of growth. And what is the state of mobile growth with respect to retention and LTV?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting, things here is that, mobile is at a super interesting moment in time, where I remember seeing an analysis. I'll have to dig up, where I saw it, but the idea is that basically the App Store leaderboards are starting to sort of become more stable over time. So whereas in the first or second or third year of the App Store, it was relatively easy to sort of move up and down. What ends up happening these days is now with, I think there's well over a million apps in the store. I think App Store is like 2 million apps. The Android Play, store is 2 million, over 2 million. And what that means is we now are in a world where it's much more competitive, to get through. And so although in the early days it was all about big splashy budgets, et cetera, one of the most interesting trends has been, these days in order to break into the App Store, in order to keep buying, installs to sustain that, you actually need an incredible amount of retention and lifetime value in order to bid it up. And so that's why, when you look at like the Supercell games, for example, one of the most important parts of Clash of Clans is that it monetizes incredibly well. And that means that they're able to then follow that up with, budgets. And so it's an interesting time because it used to be that acquisition was just all about, buying acquisition. And then now I think, we're in a world where you need that acquisition piece, but that's really facilitated with high retention, high lifetime value. And so I think every mobile app has to think about that in the new context of this much more, difficult App Store environment where it's much harder to like break through the noise.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favorite things when it comes to growth is just all these surprises and things that just, you look at it on the surface and it doesn't seem intuitive, but it will be a big win, but it turns out to be the case, or you make a big bet, but it doesn't work. And one of the things we did recently is we did this analysis in March of push notifications, and we realized that 63% of push notifications are actually being sent at the wrong time of day, and that has a significant impact on open rates and engagement rates. I was just curious, you in your experience, what are your favorite examples of some surprises that have caught you in terms of growth?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that are the most surprising really have to do with the idea that the most central thing to growth is the natural sort of product market fit that you have with your business, with your offering, and that that determines so much of what happens next, right? And similarly, for example, the cadence of how people use your product. So, for example, if you're a piece of tax software, you're just going to use it once per year, versus if you're a communications product, you might be used every hour. That there's just these natural aspects of product market fit and cadence that you can't sort of like mechanically engineer above and beyond, right? And so, if you're going back to that tax software example, or maybe your app for travel, it's just hard to get people to use your product much more than the natural cadence. And what that means is that there's just limits to growth hacking, right? There's mechanical things that you can do to optimize, where you can maybe make something go up like 10% or 20%, but it gets really hard to like fundamentally change behavior. And so I think that's an important aspect to learn, when it comes to, sort of the limits of all of this stuff, is that you really need to be able to like fundamentally, push a like great product that people use often, and that those are the raw materials that you use to, really make a company, really fly.
Great. So what is your opinion in terms of who's doing really well and maybe somebody that is not doing so well in terms of growth?
Yeah, I think there's Slack comes to mind as a company that has really found a offering that is growing virally, which is amazing, like viral B2B, right? That's everyone's dream, because you have the high monetization of B2B, but you have the zero cost of acquisition that a viral product gives you. And the last time I heard, their conversion from free to paid was also way into the double digits, above and beyond, what most SaaS products are doing. So I think, they've really figured it out in an interesting way. But, keep in mind that a lot of what makes Slack, work is that the product category just happens to be a really compelling product category that people basically are using like hours and hours every day at work, right? So I think that's really interesting. And obviously, from the mobile point of view, building a great mobile and desktop experience, I think is super important, because when it comes to communication, you kind of can't make it so that, hey, by the way, when you're away from your desk, all of a sudden people can't use your product. So I think that's a really interesting area. In terms of products that aren't crushing it, maybe I won't single out a specific company, but maybe I'll talk about a genre of companies. I think a lot of e-commerce products, I think, are really struggling because e-commerce is something that fits so well on the web as SEO and people searching to go shopping, but on mobile, there's so many challenges, right? Number one, buying stuff on mobile is weird and complicated because you don't want to type in really long credit cards. You don't have the SEO benefit in e-commerce, so because the transaction cadence is relatively low. And then you also have this issue where marketers want to use push notifications to drive a bunch of, sort of re-engagement just from discounting and that kind of thing. But I think those push notifications are quickly ignored or dismissed by users. And so I think, people are still trying to figure out if you're like an apparel, fashion, homewares type of brand, how do you actually build an engaging mobile experience? Versus I think those are often quite more successful as kind of a web plus email type property.
Great. And for the audience out there, we're joined today by Andrew Chen, who's one of the pioneers of the growth hacking community, to talk about mobile growth and retention. And if you have any questions, please tweet them at #LeanplumLive, and we'll be answering them at the end. So I want to focus the next set of questions on just team organization and alignment. And how do you really get organized to win and get started with mobile growth?
Yeah. So, Momchil, are you thinking about this as sort of like, organizing your team? Is it like internal kind of organizing? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah, and for a lot of companies out there, they're probably not mobile companies, and they want to get into mobile growth, so they need to get started. So how do you get started? Like, do you get the first person
Yeah.
on board, and or do you what do you do? Like,
Yeah.
what have you seen work?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple pieces. I think one is really understanding, the place of data and facts and decision making that's really based on, and a roadmap that's really driven by, by that data, I think is really important. And picking your, key metrics to get everyone excited. So whether that key metric is something that's big and visceral, like a signups number, or if it's something like active users, or maybe churn, in your subscriber base, right? I think all of those things are potentially like interesting. And I think once you pick those, the next step is, okay, great. Well, how do you run a small series of experiments to really show that, small kind of maybe potentially non-intuitive experiments can actually, make this whole thing work, right? And so I think what that means is you're often coming up with a short roadmap. You're putting together a small, scrappy team of people internally to just go run, some experiments. Especially, I think, the ones that are the most valuable are often the most upstream. So working on the sign-up form, the initial landing page, the home page, any of these side entrances, like these detail pages that often, get created, and then the initial like sign-up flow and getting people, into the initial kind of active state. And I think, one of the first things you need to do is you need to show that these projects, these sort of quick hit iterative projects can really, create business impact. Because once you do that, then you're able to go to the next step and you're able to really like drive and get more resourcing, to make this work.
Yeah, and so you mentioned A/B testing and experimentation. Can you talk a little bit about the role of A/B testing into all of this, and in your past experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first thing you need is you need to have a sense for your growth model. Like, how is your product actually, how's your app actually growing? Is it through word of mouth? Is it because you have a website already and you're cross-selling web traffic into, into your app, mobile, area? You have to kind of understand. I think the first thing that you do once you understand that and you're able to create kind of a step-by-step kind of numerical thing of, well, this is how many people, come to my homepage. This is the percentage that go to the App Store. This is the percentage that download. This is the percentage that sign up. This is the percentage that, become active users. Then you're able to then incrementally, in a data-driven, fact-driven way, make improvements to your product. And that fundamentally happens through A/B testing, right? And so, by having a baseline control in everything that you're doing, you're able to show with every project that, hey, this is a 5% increase or this is a 10% increase. Now, I think this is particularly super important in the case where, you're a new growth team within a company, because quantifying that lift against control is exactly the ammunition that you need in order to like run more experiments and have more people join your cause and to get get the resourcing needed to make the, the whole thing work. So, in that case, data is such an important foundational aspect, and A/B testing is the tool that you use to really show that, things are working.
Yep, and in my past experience, having run hundreds of A/B tests, at Google, and now also running a company that really focuses on experimentation, we've always seen this interesting phenomenon of the trade-off, which is that almost every experiment that I've seen being run has always been a trade-off between either revenue and growth or retention and revenue. And I'm just curious, have you seen this in your career as well? And what are the kinds of trade-offs that you usually see, and some of the unforeseen changes that maybe were affected by optimizations that you were performing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really interesting trade-offs, I think especially based on the stage, of your product. There's a famous whiteboard drawing that Paul Graham, who founded Y Combinator, had created, which is, this idea that you go through these phases of growth, and you sort of have this like tech crunch of initiation, which is kind of your big press spike, right? And that big press spike is sort of about the idea that like, that you get this big PR blast, everyone gets excited, but then quickly, novelty wears off, and you kind of have to like grind and go through this quote unquote trough of sorrow in order to kind of like find your, next, find the channels that work, your acquisition channels to really nail product market fit and like all that stuff. So when you put that together, I think the idea is that, often people think of growth as this magical thing that happens before you do like all the hard work, when in fact, the most common case is actually you need to get really strong product market fit in order to put it together. You need to get people, to get super excited about, to get super excited about the product and to have a bunch of organic growth. And then I think you're layering the optimization, the A/B testing, notification strategy, content marketing, all that stuff in order to accelerate something that's really working. So I think that's really, to me, one of the most like fundamental, misunderstandings that can happen on growth, because people kind of, put the cart before the horse, and they think of growth as this magic, weapon, when in fact, you really have to nail the fundamentals before you dive deeply into it.
Yep, and related to this, every startup here, as you mentioned earlier, is the shark fin, right? Just spending, and not just startups, any company, you spend a lot of money on acquisition, and you get a lot of usage, and then all of a sudden everybody leaves. Could you talk a little bit more about how companies can avoid this, and what are some successful strategies to drive more retention?
Yeah, retention is such a tough, difficult, area. But it's definitely worth like, kind of a deep dive. I mean, I think there's a couple of pieces. So I wrote about this recently, in a blog post, which is there's a company called Quetra, which had basically analyzed all the various usage of apps over time and the retention curves. And the first thing that you see in in this analysis that's super fascinating is actually the long-term retention of a bunch of these products pretty much look the same, right? They all kind of, wear off at about the right, at the same rates. The most interesting thing that the best products did, the top 10 apps or top 50 apps that did versus the bottom, 5,000 apps, is that actually the first like 7 days or so of usage, is, incredibly like important, right? And what that does is, it makes it so that you're able to, activate these guys, and sort of bring them into, into an activated, engaged state in the app, and then churn over time, works. I think the reason why retention itself has been so difficult to optimize is that so much of it is about the natural value proposition and the cadence of usage. And so going back to the tax example, or if you want to use an example like, travel or something like that, that becomes, you really have to make sure that stuff, works. Like it works in the, kind of cadence of like 2 times a year travel or that kind of thing. Now, the area where retention can definitely be optimized is like monetary churn for SaaS companies, because for those folks, when you're starting to optimize for like upgrades and downgrades, when you're optimizing for, involuntary churn where people's credit cards are getting expired and notifications to remind people, those things you can definitely move the needle enough that actually impacts your revenue. But when it comes to like, metrics like your daily active users divided by monthly active users, I've yet to see many examples of that changing. What I have definitely seen is people bending the curve on, on activation and also on acquisition. And so I tend to suggest to companies that those are actually kind of the places to put the most effort.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew Chen. So we're going to be wrapping up. Any last thoughts to our listeners on any main takeaways from this webinar today?
No, this is great. I think, mobile is, it's such a new area even still. And, there's so much mystery around it, because there's this opacity around, well, when people hit the App Store, like how many people are actually installing, which channels are driving what. The whole like deep linking thing hasn't been completely figured out. push notification metrics haven't been completely figured out and best practices around that. So I think, we're still in the early phases of understanding growth on mobile. And so I think this is just like a great topic, and really hope to see, more data, more discussion, more sort of strategic thinking in this area.
Sounds great. Thanks, Andrew. And just a reminder to all of our listeners that we have live questions, Q&A, and you can tweet hashtag. Live questions, Q&A, and you can tweet hashtag. Okay, so we have, as I understand it, limited time with Andrew Chen here for questions, but I just wanted to look at some of the questions that have come in through the web. So the first question is around mobile push notifications versus email. And so the question is, from an engagement point of view, how do you balance mobile push versus email, especially for consumer businesses with desktop and mobile products? And are push notifications better than email in some cases, or vice versa? What is the main takeaway here? Andrew, do you want to take a stab at this question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is a really interesting thing to talk about in generalities because, of course, it's so dependent. It's so dependent on the product, right? For example, like when people talk about like, oh well, consumers don't like push notifications. The thing I always give the example of is, well, if you're building like a communication product, let's say you were building WhatsApp, right, and you weren't sending push notifications, well, the product would just be like fundamentally broken. So I think when you think about it that way, sometimes push notifications is just like core to the experience. Now, we're kind of at an interesting time right now since push notifications are newer. They're a little bit hard to turn off. People basically tend to just uninstall apps, it seems like, rather than just, going into settings and finding the thing and turning it off. So I think because of that, you're finding that, of course, the response rate is much higher, but you also have a potential to like lose your install because people just like remove the app. So we're kind of at an interesting point where I think it makes sense to test both email and push notifications, kind of separately and then independently, just, one by one, and then to be really careful about, the context in which you're sending it. If it's something like a messaging app or something, very time dependent kind of thing, like, or like, for example, another really high importance one is, let's say you're a marketplace and you're selling a product and your product's been sold. You probably want a push notification in that case. And so these kind of timely messages that are high prominence, I think that's really important to have as push notifications. And then when you're talking about email, then you're talking about a whole other set of things. And then my final point on it is, if you're just talking about promotional messaging, I think people are a lot more accustomed to that running on email and not on push. Push, I think, because it grabs your attention, it interrupts what you're doing. I think I've published some data on my blog, which has shown that, you have a really large percentage, over 60% of folks opting out of push notifications, because they find it, useless.
Yep, and just a second on this, it's 100% the case that push notification behavior is actually different between Android and iOS, and opt-in rates, I think on iOS the standard is around mid 40%, whereas obviously on Android we have the opt-out rate, and so in a lot of cases you do have a valid reason to go and communicate with the user, but on iOS, if the majority of the users have turned off push, that may be a good reason for you to try out email. And so it's not one or the other. Oftentimes you actually want to have both as a strategy. Okay, so for the next question, we have a Seam here from India, and he's got a mobile app that is a combination of both Mint and Personal Capital. And so his question is, since his app is in the finance space, finance is something which people tend to procrastinate about. How do I deliver virality around this? Is there a scope of virality for fintech sector? I don't know if Andrew, if you have any experience at all with the fintech sector, and what does it mean to do virality in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, so there's a couple versions of that are kind of fintech. Maybe not the exact product category that that this question is about. But for example, like payments is like a really good version, right? PayPal very classically, number one, had, recognized that because you have somebody who's sending money and someone who's receiving money, that's an intrinsically viral, situation. And I think Venmo has shown that, even recently. And then of course you can combine that with a paid referral program. In the early days of PayPal, the thing that, when I talked to the folks that were early on there, the thing that really ignited it was the idea that you would, you could send $5 for free to somebody else and get $5 yourself when you signed up. And of course, what ends up happening in a case like that is you end up, actually, using that money often. It kind of bounces around the system, and you actually, end up losing less money than you think, right? So I think that's interesting. The other version I think that's worth, thinking about is literally just a straight up referral program, a la like what Wealthfront has done, where, you can give away some key functionality such as, how much, money is being managed. That's another version. The other kind of fintech thing I'll talk about is, for a while I was an advisor to Kiva, which is a microfinance, product, which is kind of like in the same realm as potentially GoFundMe or Tilt or, Kickstarter or something like that. And in that world, of course, it's sort of like a group, fundraising money, collection thing. And so, whenever there was a really interesting, project, then a lot of folks would band together and do it. So I think, and then that also has a nonprofit angle as well, which attracts people. So I think you can figure out how to do this around the edges, but I think one of the things you have to figure out is, why would virality is obviously nice to have, right? It's like getting free users is of course everybody wants it, but you have to figure out whether or not it's actually right for your product. And sometimes it's just not right for your product in the same way that sometimes paid marketing is not right for your product. If you sell, a product that doesn't monetize well, then you're not going to be able to pay very much for it. And as much as you might want to juice that with paid marketing, that may not be able to happen. And so I think you have to sort of think of virality in the same way. There has to be sort of a product to channel kind of, match in order for virality to be a viable channel. So go ahead, Momchil.
Great. So the next question is on personalization in mobile apps, and if there is any specific distinct example that you can share with a before and after improvement based on past experience.
Yeah, Momchil, do you want to take a crack at this first, actually? And then maybe I'll follow up on that.
Yeah,
I think you've probably seen a ton of examples here.
Yeah, we work with a lot of companies, and then some of the ones that, some of my favorite ones, there's an example with a company called Last Minute Travel that we did, and it was actually related to the same question that you brought up earlier about the opt-in rates for push notifications. And this company, they had 22% opt-in rate for push, and they were able to leverage personalization and the power of context to be able to drive their opt-in rates to 62%. So that's almost a tripling. And what they did is actually very simple, right? So on iOS, when you ask for push notifications, you only have one chance to ask, and most people really burn this chance up front in the app without necessarily giving the context to the user of why they need to enable push notifications. And what Last Minute Travel did is they used an in-app message. It's a pre-permission prompt in 5 different places. They actually A/B tested a lot of different locations. They ended up picking 5 to be able to explain to the user in the context of where they are currently why they need to enable push. So for example, if you're just about to book a flight or you just booked a flight, they may ask you, hey, do you want to get notified if the flight gets delayed? And if so, please enable push notifications. And this is just the power of context, again, and personalization of being able to drive behavior, but just being able to really affect that behavior and to be able to do it through in-app messaging and really good targeting. And a lot of these strategies, I have to say, do require A/B testing. The first thing Last Minute tried did not necessarily give them the 3x increase, but it was just the iterations over and over and over, and just really trying to tune the different interactions with the customer to be able to optimize things. Is that's really what got them to essentially a tripling of their opt-in rates on iOS.
Okay. Cool. When do we go to the next one?
Did you have any? Great. So the next question is on onboarding, and specifically any particular good onboarding methods for being able to affect the retention curve. And do you have any best practices that you can share?
Yeah. So I wrote a blog post a while back in partnership with a company called Quetra. And what they do is they basically monitor how people are engaging with, with Android apps. And as a result, was able to pull together a really, really interesting, large sample size case study on, the top mobile apps, as well as, some of the smaller ones. And this is, of course, they're able to do this basically without actually putting an SDK into the apps, just by monitoring how people were opening and closing the apps. Really, really interesting, study. And, the result of that I think was really interesting is that, it's not that the best apps and the worst apps retain better long-term, right? When you look at the cohort, diagrams, for the most part, the curves were about the same. The thing that really seemed to drive the difference was actually something really simple, which was just the very first 10 days of use, right, were much better for the top apps. And so when you think about it that way and you sort of say, okay, well, why is that? What is it because, is it because of activation, and I think that's one potential, reason. So I think, let me dive into that. I think the second is just purely product positioning, people sort of immediately know, that they have a use for, a product. I think that's really important. On the first one, on activation, I think the big question is basically there's a moment, all apps kind of look the same initially, right? You go and download an app, there's a sign up screen, you go into the product, they all kind of look and act the same. I think the ones that, I think the main question to ask here, and I think what can be potentially really compelling is, when's the aha moment where somebody really gets, why this thing is there. For Uber, of course, actually requesting the car and having the car show up, I mean, that's just amazing, right? That's magical. And so, a lot of what I would think about is, okay, well, how do you find that magic moment within your product, and how do you accelerate it so that you can show that as soon as possible, right? And I think, okay, well, great. Now, if the user leaves and you push notify them and you try to do some of these things, yeah, sometimes that kind of thing can, kind of incrementally optimize. But, really it's about finding that magic moment in your product. For Facebook, it's very likely, the first time you see your friends feed and you see all this great stuff in there. For a product like, Snapchat, it's probably the first time a friend sends you a message. Right. And so I think there's a really interesting question of how do you just get to that as soon as possible. And then the second piece on the product positioning side is, I think it's really important that these products, that your consumers and your users are able to describe, what you're doing, in a very succinct way. Right. And so, a lot of times we as entrepreneurs and as product people, we tend to be very ambitious in, what we're doing. And so, but I think, when you really go down into layman's terms, very human terms of how people describe the product, it's often better to just match that messaging. So for example, when you ask people about what is Facebook, right? Now I think there's sort of this understanding that it's the social network and there's a social graph and, it sort of does all that stuff. But the layman's version of it and what they actually use in the invites is it's a service that lets people share photos, right? And then PS, also, events and messages and other cool stuff. But it's very much about photos. And if you send somebody an email invite on Facebook, you can really get a sense of that. So I think, that's the other piece is really finding, the right language and the right value proposition to lead somebody in the first 60 seconds of the product experience.
Great. I'd like to thank all of our listeners and everybody who joined us for the webinar today. I'd also like to thank Andrew Chen for his time. It has been great to have a conversation on high-performance mobile growth and retention with one of the leaders in the space. Thanks, everyone, again, and have a great day.
Cool. Thanks for having me.